You are now listening to the IELTS podcast. Learn from tutors and ex-examiners who are masters of IELTS preparation.
Hello there. In this episode, I'm talking with Fiona from Target English. She has written exams, she's written published books, especially related to the IELTS, very experienced teacher and all-round fantastic person. In this episode, we discuss the grammar you need for the writing tasks, and she tells us powerful ways we can learn this using frameworks and structures, and she tells us how to take control of the speaking part 3, comparing views, and how you can do this. And it's a great technique for coming up with ideas and opinions which you can use for both the speaking and the writing. And this is a 40-minute episode, so you got lots of information and lots of good quality IELTS related information. She tells us the value of learning the synonyms, of how to increase your vocabulary, how to predict answers and why you should do it. This is a great episode. This is one of my favourites. If you want more episodes like this, go over to IELTSpodcast.com and there you can download the whole back catalogue. But for now, this one is available for everyone. Enjoy. Alright, I've got a few questions here. Most of them are related to the book. I'll just give you a quick overview. I thought what we could do is first talk about the book, Grammar for IELTS, and then we'll talk about the grammar structures, maybe the grammar areas that are covered in the book, and then the vocabulary, and talk about how students do the comparison between like model essays and then their essays, things like that. And then for the second part, if that's okay with you, we could talk about the 2 courses you've got at Target English.
Yeah.
And now the other material you have on the website, you've got the book, Grammar for IELTS.
We have, yes, our favourite book, which makes us sound very nerdy.
When did you write this?
This one was written in 2012. It was last summer. Yeah, it was quite an interesting book. I mean, Joe and I are very focused on the fact that because IELTS is a 4 skills test, grammar often seems to get sidelined, and yet, students who are, good at manipulating grammatical structures find it much easier to do both sort of the reading and the listening in terms of comprehension. It just gives you a sort of a quicker way to sort of access meaning more than anything else. And then also, they're better, we find, at producing things in the productive skills of speaking and writing. They do come up with or aware of the need to produce more complex sentences and more complex areas of grammar, which can then obviously target the 6.5 bands which most of them are looking for to get into university.
Could you give us examples of the grammar structures that are needed before they could even consider a 7 or an 8?
Yes, good question. I mean, I think some of the things that appear in sort of attention to detail, so things like articles, countable, non-countable nouns, singular, plurals, and verb and subject agreement, you often find in the listening and reading, students make very small errors by not understanding that they needed to put an article in the gap, or it should be a plural noun, or that when they're, say, matching sentences, they look at meaning and they match up, the first half of a sentence with the second where the verb is singular and the subject is plural. And these are sort of silly mistakes that really they need to try and eliminate fairly quickly by having a bit more of an attention to detail about certain things, such as those kinds of structures. The other things I think that are important, tenses do cover kind of all 4 skills really. If you've got a good understanding of tenses, you're able to see the kind of moves in text. Often in reading text, there's a little the first paragraph will talk about the current situation of a topic, and then the text moves into the past, and then the final paragraph will talk about the future. And just by being able to see those kinds of things and recognize the tenses quickly, you can see, okay, does this text follow that kind of article style of going present, past, future, or is it slightly different? And that enables the student to get a handle on what kind of might be coming in the text as they're reading.
Right.
Also, in terms of, the speaking component, often students will not realize that the examiner's asking them questions in tenses, especially in the part one, kind of, what did you like studying when you were at school, or, what are you going to do, study at university? And instead of repeating the structures or thinking, how can I manipulate this to get in a range of language, they answer without the tense. So somebody says, for example, how long have you been studying English? And they say 5 years. And you think, well, what the examiner really wants you to say is, well, I first started studying English when I was 5, and since then I've been studying it, every week, blah, blah, blah. And in the future, I think what I'm going to do with my English is, and you think, all of those suddenly become ticks in the examiner's mind.
Yes.
And demonstrates that the student is able to very fluently kind of reel off the tenses. So those, again, can be important. And then when you look at the writing, obviously if students can produce passives and accurate modal structures, especially in task 2, where they're asked to, do a sort of a discursive piece, using shoulds and woulds and if structures, and it can be argued, and these kinds of things, again, are going to sort of push their score higher, even if they're making a few mistakes. They're attempting it, but they recognize that this kind of grammatical structure is used in, say, speculation or evaluation, which is what you're being asked to do in the question.
Right. Could you just expand on that, and speculation and the evaluation?
Well, when they students have, say, like a problem and solution essay, could be, what's one of the classic ones, or traffic problems in cities, and suggest possible ways to solve traffic problems in cities. And then they can say, well, if cities imposed, taxation on cars, then this would or could or might reduce congestion. And then being able to manipulate that structure as to whether or not you use would, could, or might has a kind of nuance of meaning that is a higher sort of level of language processing, really. And then once you've said would, you know that the example that you use, so for example, in London, since the introduction of the congestion charge, traffic has been reduced considerably. You've got a concrete example, whereas if you were using could, you might then speculate on something that hasn't been tried out yet by any country or any city. And you could say, so for example, we need to, if we increase the price of cars, people wouldn't buy as many cars, and this would help. So it's that kind of understanding, really, of what grammar is there for in terms of making meaning. And I think, it is maybe for higher level students, but also with these kinds of grammatical structures, many of them are quite formulaic. So even if you're working with lower level students, you can get them to do things like, well, if we have an if structure at the beginning, what possibilities can we finish this if structure with? Give me one with could, give me one with would. And you don't necessarily have to go through the horror of teaching all of the conditionals. Teach these fixed phrases and say, okay, if you're going to use if, you're going to suggest an answer, a possibility, here's how we do it. And actually focus on more about the meaning and teach the grammar structure as a fixed phrase, rather than trying to get them to really understand all of the different reasons why we might use conditionals.
I see. So
See what I mean? Yeah.
so you give them sort of like the structure, and it's almost it's like a shortcut, but it's a highly practical shortcut because at the end of the day we're talking about exam preparation, not dominating the English language.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing, they need tools, and they need sort of a wide range of tools, and it may be skills, but also grammar shouldn't be ignored, because it is a really useful skill in order to sort of demonstrate range. I mean, this is one of the things that is in the marking criteria in the speaking and writing is range of language.
Yeah.
And so the wider number of structures that they can produce. And again, they don't always have to be 100% accurate, but at least they're demonstrating to the examiner that they know what this structure is and they've attempted to use it in the right way in order to increase their score.
When you was talking about the conditionals and giving examples, if the student's going to give an example, you said for example, take the congestion charge in London. Mm-hmm. Now we've got two options. Could you give an example in the writing? Can you write an example, but set it up hypothetically, like if there was a congestion charge in Barnsley, the effects probably wouldn't be blah blah blah.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that a valid way to give an example, to give a hypothetical example?
Absolutely, yes, very much so. Yeah, and again, you can start. Teachers can play around with this kind of thing with students by giving them the grammatical frame.
Mm-hmm.
If blah blah blah, then this could blah blah blah, and the students can practice filling in the information.
Yes.
And then you can keep changing the context. Okay, now let's think about pollution. Mm-hmm. Let's think about, I don't know, children watching too much TV. And then each time they're just filling in the ideas around this grammatical sentence frame. And over time, the sentence structure, the grammatical structure becomes kind of embedded in them. Because the other thing is obviously, generating ideas for some students in the speaking and writing can be quite traumatic, especially under time pressure. And so what you really kind of want to do is to get them to think, like, I know the grammar structures, and these can be applied to many different questions. Mm-hmm. What I just need to do is fill in the gaps with some good ideas.
And once they've got this solid grammar structures, these structures under control, and they know where to place them, in effect, we're just going to be changing the vocabulary in there, the nouns. Take people, for example. Take European people, for example. Take London. Take the city of London, for example, and just keep interchanging those two, the different nouns or the different vocabulary. But we've got the base structure there, the basic structure.
Absolutely. And what we've found kind of doing a lot of this with students is that it's really good for their confidence.
Yeah.
Because suddenly they realise that they can just sort of produce this language, and without too much focus on trying to get all the grammatical words in the right order and, what auxiliary verb goes here and this kind of thing.
Exactly.
It's quite useful, I think.
Yeah.
Especially, again, for students who are nervous as well, because it can be a crutch that says, this I'm good at.
That's true. That's so true. And before you said the student could get nervous trying to think of ideas. Do you have any tips for trying to find ideas? Because it's a common situation where a student says, my mind just goes blank, or they might just think like, I don't know anything about gender equality. It's never, ever entered my mind, and now I'm supposed to write 250 words about it.
Yeah. I mean, one thing is obviously in the preparation, they really should be going through the sort of standard topics that tend to come up, so that they sort of cover that kind of thing. But they don't need
Sorry? what?
They need to kind of prepare and think about ideas for some of these topics, whether it's media, welfare, pollution, technology, all of these kinds of things, the workplace. What kinds of questions could you be asked about these topics, both in the task 2, also in task 1, what kind of graphs might come up about education? It could be a comparison between schools in different countries. It could be exam grades from the past to the present. Getting them to kind of predict these types of things so that there are fewer surprises when they're in the actual text. But also when they're practicing, I think a lot of students think they need loads of ideas. They don't. If you're only writing 250 words in a task 2 essay, 2 ideas is kind of enough. And also when you're speaking, you don't need that many ideas because you can expand and give examples and draw comparisons and this kind of thing. So just being able to come up with, say, 2 opposing ideas should generally be enough. And also I think students sometimes over-personalize. They think it has to be their idea. One of the things I always find useful to tell students is, in both the speaking and the writing task 2, is pick somebody that you know who's very opinionated and just use their ideas.
Yeah,
because
that's a good idea.
If you depersonalize it, you don't focus quite so much on how you should express this idea. You just kind of get it down and can work with it. I always say, I use my father because he's got lots of opinions about lots of things, and I write down what he thinks. And also, because often I disagree with him, I can think of the opposite. So in a discursive essay, or if you want to show the opposing view in, say, part 3 of the speaking, I've got a natural way of forcing myself to think of the opposite in order to give a balanced view about the topic.
So you use this technique of thinking of somebody who has a lot of opinions, who's probably very vocal on a wide range of subjects, and then just taking their ideas. So you can, you have a lot of material to use, and second, you can focus on delivering the material.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And you use this technique for both for the writing, for discursive essays, to give that balanced views, different views, and also for part 3 of the speaking.
Yeah.
So for part 3 of the speaking, you recommend looking at 2 different sides.
Well, I think sometimes it demonstrates that you can take control of the conversation to the examiner, rather than the examiner saying, "Oh yes, but what do you think about this?" and providing you with the opposing view. The student can say, "However, other people have this idea," or "I'm not sure I agree with this because of blah blah blah."
Right.
And then alternatively, they could ask the examiner, "I'm not sure I agree with this. What about you?" And in terms of that kind of taking control of where the conversation is going, it can be a good idea, I think.
I see. Right. Okay. Now going back to the writing, it says it can in the copy it says the units include exercises on vocabulary, and grammar structures, but just focusing on vocabulary, are you aware of a good technique to increase a student's vocabulary, and how can they practice this?
Basically, I think synonyms is one of the key areas. I mean, the IELTS exam in the reading, excuse me, and listening is basically based on synonyms. And so when you do question analysis with students of looking at, why was this the right answer? And why were these the wrong answers? And obviously, one of the things that you tell students is, well, if you see the same words in the text in the answer, it's probably not the right answer.
That's one trick they'll use. They'll put the same words in there, but and if it's a simple matchup, be aware because it's probably a trick.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so then when you start looking at, okay, well, this answer, said, in the text it says reasons and the answer was factors. Okay, well, what have we got here? We've got a way in which it's been easy for the test writer to write this, to see if you can spot where the answer is and then what the answer is. And if you're working with students on synonyms, really it's kind of two areas. One is sort of generic, I think they call them carrier words or something, things like analysis, factor, reason, advantage, benefit, influence, all of these kinds of words that do have quite a lot of synonyms where it's easy maybe to manipulate, and especially to manipulate, or as well as synonyms, to manipulate between, say, verb and noun, or noun and adjective, this kind of thing. And then specific kind of topic-based words which have synonyms or others that don't have synonyms, and getting students to be able to recognize where words carry a high kind of level of meaning or where the meaning is maybe more general. And this gets them to kind of, they need to get, with vocabulary, they need to try and get a little bit inside the test writer's head. And think about the different types of question and how the questions are written. So you can work a lot with things like in the reading, the heading matching uses a lot of synonyms and also the summary writing tasks. How is the test writer reducing something?
Now, you said before, you spoke about higher meaning and a general meaning. Could you explain that, please?
Yeah. If you have a sentence like, the effects of pollution on the environment are bad, then we can look at things like, well, effects might have some synonyms, or is likely to have some synonyms. We could have impact or something. Pollution, this is quite specific. Are there likely to be more synonyms for this? Environment, what could we have? Nature. Is nature the same as environment? How do they differ? The effects of the pollution on the environment are bad. Okay, bad is quite a neutral word. What would you say if you wanted to make it stronger? You could have catastrophic or something like this. And when students start playing around with these kinds of sentences, they can see how the test writer might change meaning in the question, or use synonyms, or use slightly different ways of expressing the same thing. And then they can start thinking, well, how similar is that? Because if a word has a very specific meaning, the answer is going to need to have a specific meaning. It needs to be at the same level. And that's what the test writers, when we sit down and kind of write the textbooks or the test writers, you spend a lot of time trying to think, okay, if I write this question, I want the answer to be C. How am I going to make it so that that's the only possible answer? And sometimes you get to a situation where you're like, actually, I can't. Can't make it tight enough.
Sorry, say that again.
The test writer sometimes can't make it 100% obvious that that's the only answer. So they kind of have to abandon that question and look somewhere else in the text or the listening and think, okay, I'll have to test a different area.
Okay.
Sometimes students can, not all students, but if you explain a little bit about this to some students, especially if they're quite analytical, it gives them an insight really into what they're looking for. They're trying to crack the system. And if they know how it was designed, it's quite useful.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice, especially for the engineers who are have got their head full of numbers, and they come to a language or a language-based problem, and it's such a challenge. And if they can just analyze it so they just focus on the question, and they try and get inside the examiner's head by looking for the different synonyms. For example, bad if the question is the effects of pollution are bad, and then one of the answers is catastrophic, it could be the answer, but it's not going to be because it's a different level.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, if all of the other possibilities don't say anything about bad, then possibly yes. But it's that, level of analysis and that maybe sort of process of eliminating wrong answers rather than looking for right answers.
Now, to get this skill is just a case of question analysis. And practice and practice and practice.
Yeah. Students, I think, tend to focus quite a lot on, increasing their vocabulary. I mean, they can to a certain extent, but they've got to be able to manipulate it as well. And so if you're going through with questions, or if they're looking at questions, they should be able, as they're reading a question, for the listening and for the reading, they should be substituting synonyms or possible synonyms as they go along. So if we say, what were the effects of pollution on the environment, if that's a question, and they've got to say an A, B, C, D, then they need to be saying, what was the impact of, I don't know, acid rain on nature? As they're reading, what can they substitute? So that when they're listening or when they're reading, they've done the kind of prediction on these kind of vocabulary items as to what they might come across, because they're not going to see or hear the same words.
Right. So in effect, they're trying to second guess.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Generating the synonyms and already thinking of possibilities before jumping into the text and looking for those possible options.
Yeah.
I see. And the same with the listening. When they're reading, the actual listening, the questions, the mind needs to be generating possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
I see. And then
it's kind of an extension of the thing that a lot of textbooks do, where they're asking students to underline keywords. There's no point underlining the keywords if you don't know what the synonyms are likely to be, or you've got no way of spotting them, because then all you've done is underline the things you can't find.
I see. All right. Wow, that is great advice. That. Okay. I just remembered one question. I remember I was reading, and there you have the opportunity to compare model answers with their own answers.
Yeah.
When a student does this comparison, what should they be looking for?
Okay, so most of the books, when they say that, there's I think the question or the exercise says, look at yours and then see if you produced the language that the example produced. So really the idea is that students should do this. If they're going to do it in the speaking version, it'd be nice if they could record themselves so that they can listen to what they did. They've got the transcript for the speaking ones, and they've got obviously the text. And it's just going through, looking at that unit. What is that unit teaching you? And then go through the model answers, highlight how many examples. Say it might be a particular grammar structure, or it might be certain vocabulary, or a certain skill, and then see if yours contains the same thing. And then if not, do it again.
Right, and just to compare, contrast, analyze, and then repeat, and just follow that pattern.
Absolutely.
For the writing, for the speaking. Your books, they cover all of these skills, and it goes into more detail.
Yeah.
And if the student has the books, they can start practicing all this. It's got examples, a long list of exercises and work they can do with the books.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, Collins, the publisher is Collins, and they decided that they wanted to do some self-study books because there weren't any available, and to split them up into the skills. So students could kind of identify strong and weak points, and if they only needed to buy the book on reading, for example, then so be it. And the idea is that you can work through the exercises yourself, There's a lot of practice material. So at the end of each of the unit, in all of the books, there's an exam practice section. And they've got full answers. So all of the speaking and writing questions and practice tests have got model answers, which I think is useful. But alternatively, the books can be used, as a classroom book if a teacher wanted to, or supplementary material, that kind of thing. But they're quite staged. I think they're quite easy to use. The feedback that we've had from teachers and students is that the instructions are quite clear. The description of the different tasks for the exams and sort of the exam tips and things like that are very easy to understand. They're very practical.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Fiona. Do you have anything you'd like to mention before we finish up?
I don't think so. Well, actually, only one thing. A lot of people do ask about exam strategies and this kind of thing. Yeah. I would just say that really students need to know their own sort of abilities and make a strategy. It's very sort of personal to them, know their strengths and weaknesses, and if they're going to practice the test, have another way, rather than just doing practice tests over and over again, to see if they can measure how they're improving. I
see. So they need to... one thing is doing practice test after practice test, but they need actual feedback and spend some time actually analysing.
Absolutely.
Rather than just running through the forest with a blindfold on.
Yes, absolutely. That's what I wanted to say. Yep, I think that's all really.
Thanks for listening to IELTSpodcast.com. And remember to leave your email for updates and early access to new podcasts.